If you've grown up in the West, you were likely inundated with expectations as a child, such as that you were meant for greatness or that you're destined to somehow change the world. Even if you weren't fed those exact words, you've certainly encountered the sentiment in media, on TV, in school, and across the Western world in general. We've cultivated a national delusion that everyone's a winner, that every child is a diamond waiting in the coal or a magnificent sculpture just waiting to be freed from the unpolished marble. When in reality, the vast majority of kids are not art pieces, but tools destined not for a museum, but for the proverbial mines. I say that not as any kind of indictment on the material quality of their souls, but as a blunt observation of how things actually work. And worse still is, we tell ourselves that this delusion is for our children's benefit, when in truth it's all about feeding the parents' shallow egos. Think about it. No parent wants to be told they're raising a loser or a retard, especially not when they've literally gone and put all their eggs into that one basket. We live in a world and culture that lives off of telling people whatever they want to hear in exchange for votes and dollars. That's capitalism, some may say. But the problems with a society that's financially and politically incentivized to gas up, glaze, gaslight, and generally misinform its population should be self-evident to anyone with more brain cells than teeth. Any society that needs to rely on lies to remain solvent is always going to drown in hypocrisy. This is why I've always taken a firm stance against any and all forms of organized religion. The main argument I've heard promoting, which being that it's the source of morality, by which is usually meant that it's the source of social cohesion, which is unfortunately correct. But if we believe that reality is true by definition, and that material substance is the basis for objective reality, then anything that contradicts the physics must be wrong by definition. Therefore, any metaphysics that doesn't derive from physics is a fantasy, and a fantasy that's clung onto even in light of contrary evidence is the literal definition of a delusion. The core issue that I see pervading the world at present is one of fundamentalist paradox, one which I've illustrated before by drawing a comparison between the Jedi and Sith codes. The former, if taken at face value, is nothing more than an ideological wish list. The very first line, for example, states as though an empirical fact that emotions don't exist, which is patently untrue, and can easily be proven so by anyone who wasn't literally born yesterday, something that the Sith Code admonishes and rejects with its own very first line, and which it follows up with statements that are objectively correct, at least up until the last one, which is where the fallacy of the dark side and its adherents shines most radiantly. Basically, the Sith want power to break their chains, but they seek it through the very medium that put those chains on them in the first place. Meanwhile, the Jedi ostensibly strive to become one with all life, but their code advocates for a world of infinite stagnation, which is antithetical to the very concept. The consequence of this disparity between lofty idealism and cynical pragmatism is two sides of a doomed coin, each one striving towards a vision of transcendence. One for all, the other for only one, but all either ends up achieving is damnation. Many times I've heard it said that there can be no morality without God, and most of those same people will also insist that God is necessary to explain the existence and complexity of the universe. Both of these two assertions are objectively false. Note, I'm not saying definitively whether or not a God or gods exists, just that their existence is not actually necessary to explain the observable functions of reality. My newest theory of why they cling to this notion as fervently as they do, no matter how compelling or comprehensive the contrarian evidence, is that the words world and universe to them mean essentially the same thing, meaning that when they say the universe, they don't actually mean that ginormous black thing up there in the sky with all the twinkling lights in it. What they're actually referring to is the portion of the planet Earth on which they and the people they know and care about live. I.e., they're talking about society, as that to them is what constitutes the totality of existence, which is how most people would define the universe, which isn't so much the fault of stupidity or undereducation, although these things are still as plentiful as ever, as that the human brain isn't evolved to cope with much more than a few hundred people and a horizon's worth of terrain. And as a consequence, the majority of people, regardless of their religion or politics, have little to no appreciation for just how impersonally huge the universe actually is. Now, why am I telling you all this? Partially, it's to help you understand where most people who are telling you you're the center of the universe are really coming from when they say this. They tell you that you have freedom of choice, and that you have a responsibility to make good and productive choices. But that's only because they're hypocrites who are far more invested in feeling like they're good people than they are in actually laying a consistent logical foundation for their so-called principled beliefs. This attitude of self-righteous moralism permeates every facet of their culture, and consequently infests all aspects of life under their reign. In case it wasn't obvious who I mean by they, I'm mainly talking about the boomers, as it is they who predominantly shaped our modern world in all ways, socially, politically, economically, culturally, etc., for better or worse. And if you've not had your head stuck in the sand for the last 20 years, it's mainly for the worse, at least for the rest of us. And I'm sure you're also all accustomed to getting the old pull yourself up by your bootstraps refrain from that same crowd. In an older video, I outlined why I view life as a continuous game, not a mission. The summary of that earlier thesis goes as follows. There is no plan, there is no aim. You're good enough until you're not, and then you're done. That's what life is. That's all it's ever really been. Nothing you can do will change that. Nothing you can do will last more than a few generations before being either buried or unrecognizably altered. Evolution marches on. It is the way of the universe. If you live like you're the main character, you'll most likely die disappointed and distraught that you failed in your world-changing quest. So don't despair. Don't set yourself up for misery by pretending to be something more than what any of us are. A band of lonely animals trying to make our way through a murky mess of a world. Become your own beacon, your own cardinal north, your own Venus. You live in the most informationally dense period ever experienced by men, so make the most of it. Don't fall for the delirious traps set by others. Don't lose yourself in their webs. Don't swallow their poison. Don't burden yourself with their expectations. If your name's not on their will, their payroll, or their birth certificate, you don't owe anyone else a goddamn thing. Live life for yourself to the best of your ability. Charge yourself in ambition only what you're truly able and willing to pay off with energy. There's no sense in hurling yourself onto a pyre for a world that views you as disposable. But as usual, that's all just my 2 cents on the issue. Be sure to share yours down below. And of course, if you wouldn't mind also tapping the like and subscribe buttons if you haven't already, I'd appreciate that too. Or you could also join up as a member or check out my books on Amazon. They're good for a spot of thoughtful distraction, if nothing else. And until next time, as always, stay safe, stay sane, and remember, time is life's foremost currency. Not a demarcation of value, but its very source, for it quite literally is your life, and you can never earn or steal any more of it than you started with. So guard it well and spend it wisely, and may peace ever be upon you.